On Sunday, Pastor Sean walked through why calling yourself a servant of God can actually be a way of putting yourself above other people, and what genuine humility looks like when grace is actually doing its work. This is worth hearing.
I tell you, I stopped right there when I read that word servant. You know, nowadays, in some corners of the church, you'll hear that phrase, servant of God, used as a title. And quite often when somebody uses that phrase, servant of God, it is to elevate themselves. And people revere and they go, servant of God. And they're put on this pedestal. And so we can misunderstand what Paul means when he says servant of God. And so he makes sure as well that we understand what he means, because he says, though I am less than the least of God's people. He makes it very clear that when he says servant, he means servant. When somebody says servant and they mean CEO, God's man of power for the hour, when the word servant becomes a title that puts you on a pedestal, you've got to question what's going on. But no, Paul meant servant. He took that position of servant. Servant of God. It's something that he took very, very seriously. Because you see, Paul knew his past. Paul knew where he had come from. Just like the prodigal knew where he had come from. And he came back to his father, didn't he? He went off full of bravado, that young man. He said, Father, give me my share of the inheritance. And off he went and lived like a king. But very soon it all went wrong and he was humbled. And he came back and he said, Father, I'm content to be a servant. Paul took that very, very seriously, because something happened to Paul on that Damascus road. He met with God. And I want to tell you that when you have met with God, then servant will mean servant to you. It's impossible to meet God and become proud. It's impossible to meet God and become arrogant. And so that's a good test when you meet people that claim to be servants of God or men of God. Ask yourself, what kind of character am I dealing with? What kind of spirit am I dealing with? Because when somebody has met with God, it will humble them. And it humbled Paul. And Paul, who had been going all over the countryside, chasing after Christians, persecuting them, holding the coats while they are stoned, like when Stephen was killed. That man that everyone feared, now describes himself as a servant. He says, for I am the least. This is what he says about himself in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, for I am the least of the apostles, and do not even deserve to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. He knew his past. He knew that his position was by grace. It made him, grace made him a servant. Everything that Paul is talking about is what grace made him. He says, I became a servant of this gospel by the gift of God's grace given to me through the working of his power. Paul says, everything that I am, I was made by grace. Good for us to keep a check on that in ourselves and in others. Do we see others? Do we see ourselves through that lens of grace? God's undeserved and unmerited favor. And he was content to call himself a servant. It says in Matthew 20, 25 to 26, I just want to rest here for a minute. It said, Jesus called them together and said that you know the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Now, he is not describing a CEO of a church. He is not describing an apostle of apostles. He is not describing a televangelist. He is describing the people out there in the world. And he's saying, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles, Gentiles is just another word for nations in this context. He's saying, look around at all the nations and see how their rulers behave. See how people in authority behave. The high officials exercise authority over them. They lord it over them. And then he says, not so with you. Now, if Jesus is saying, not so with you, to those 12 that he had called, those men of God who we revere even today, if he said to them, not so with you, how much more not so with us as believers, whatever position we hold in the church, whatever we do in the church. He said, not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. That's Paul's philosophy. That's what drove his ministry. Not being a lord, not lording it over people, but servanthood. Servanthood. Grace, and listen to this, grace didn't teach him servanthood, it made him a servant. See, that's what grace does. Grace makes something of you. I think we miss that sometimes. Sometimes we think that this grace, by grace you have been saved. We all know that, right? And we think, okay, by grace I'm saved, and now with God's help I'm going to make something of myself. No man of God ever made anything of himself. No woman of God ever made anything of herself. The grace of God comes into our life and it makes us something. It is grace from start to finish. That's what Paul had to explain to the Galatians. It's grace from start to finish. I love what he says in Titus. In Titus chapter 2, it says, for the grace of God has appeared that offers salvation to all people. It teaches us to say no to ungodly and worldly passions. Grace teaches us. It trains us, but actually it gets into us and teaches our heart and changes our heart. That's what grace does. It makes us into the people that God wants us to be. And grace made Paul a servant. Grace made Paul a servant. Now, it says in 1 Corinthians 15, where he talked about being the least of the apostles, immediately after that, he says, but by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace to me was not without effect. No, I worked harder than all of them. Now, listen to this. Yet not I, but the grace of God that was with me. He began to say, I work harder than everyone. And then he said, no, not me. I wasn't working hard, but grace did something in me. That's absolutely fundamental to what being a Christian is. Everything comes by grace. God begins to change us, to transform us, to change us from the inside out. And that includes not only what we are, what we believe. It includes not only forgiveness, but what we do. It begins to change us and transform us. Paul was utterly transformed by grace. It made him what he was. He was working very hard before to persecute Christians, but now grace got a hold of him and all of that changed. Grace works in us. Grace made Paul a servant, and grace will make us servants as well. Grace will change our heart. It will change our attitude. I've seen lots of people down through the years change. And when people really change, you will never look at them in the church and say of them that, oh, they've really changed. They got on that program. They tried so hard to change themselves. They went into the gym and they really tried really hard. No, whenever I have seen someone completely transformed in the church, it has always been that God has done. You can see that it's God. You can see that it is God who has changed and transformed them. I told you the other week about my friend Ben Cheesy. Anyone remember the story of Ben Cheesy? That guy's a pastor today. That guy was an acrobat. That guy was a drunkard. He used to come into church and do somersaults. When you're trying to preach, he was doing somersaults across the aisle. And it was just, there was something that guy could never change on his own. But Jesus got him, and you could see him begin to change. And you would say, that guy's changed because of Jesus. See, he never would have tried before. He's not trying to change, but grace is working in him and making him to work hard. That's what Paul's saying.